Hello and welcome to Deeptech Talk, a tech podcast from BIS Research. I am your host Anushka, and today we have Jeremy Chignell, who is a senior fermentation engineer at Synonym, and he also has a significant experience in leading food technology firms such as the Good Food Institute, Cargill, DuPont, and others. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for joining today.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
So, in today's podcast, we'll try to uncover some deep tech insights around precision fermentation and alternate proteins and understand how it is going to impact the overall food industry and the relatable market as well. So, Jeremy, first of all, I would like to start with a question that I have out of curiosity that what inspired you to get into the precision fermentation alternate proteins field?
Well, so I think from a relatively early time in my college career, I was concerned about issues of sustainability and particularly with respect to food, and in particular with respect to protein consumption. So that sort of gradually led to academic study, and then actually in my research in graduate school and after, I was mostly concerned with biofuels or
Mhm.
bioenergy, and then after graduate school, I moved into more of the food tech world, working for DuPont and Cargill, and I worked on a variety of projects, but really found myself trending toward precision fermentation as a nice solution for or a nice technology for solving many different types of problems, whether you're talking about protein production or you're talking about materials or additives, or even now we're talking about even more exotic products such as clothing, fibers for clothing, textiles, that kind of thing. So it the technology was appealing just for its versatility and also for its rigor. I mean, I do feel like it's a nice, rigorous combination of engineering and biology, which is both of which are challenging. So.
Understood. So, like, since you said that uh, since very early years of your career, you were interested in the sustainable things and sustainability criteria and all those things. So, would you be able to explain, like, how do you think that precision fermentation and alternate proteins contribute towards a sustainable food system?
Sure. I mean, I think alternate protein. I would point people to the GFI website, which is going to be able, Good Food Institute, which is going to be
Mm-hmm.
able to summarize things, a lot more comprehensively than I would be able to. But I think it's pretty clear that food production is a huge part of greenhouse gas emissions through via
Right.
agriculture. In particular, protein production is an outsized contributor. So, when we talk about other ways to produce food than we have traditionally done, um, we're sort of limited to, we only have a handful of technologies as humans. We have agriculture, which we've been doing for 10,000 years, but we're finally in a position where maybe we can start to think outside of the confines of just sort of growing plants for food. And so I do feel like precision fermentation offers this new opportunity. We can truly make any, I mean, in theory, of
Mm-hmm.
course, not in actuality yet, but in theory, we can truly, there's an opportunity to be able to make any protein in
Right.
any location. And so we're no longer coupled to, produce in the US, for example, we're not necessarily tied to making milk proteins only in the Midwest or in California. We can
Right.
actually make these proteins anywhere that they might be necessary and at any scale that they might be necessary. So you could even imagine, a particular restaurant that has a precision fermentation system in the back that makes their own sort of dairy products for their own particular use. So we're kind of decoupling, protein production in
Mm-hmm.
particular from from the traditional ways of producing them, which I think is exciting, and puts the power in it diversifies the power of food production and control over food and security over food.
Right. Okay, so like as you talked about the traditional fermentation methods and how the precision fermentation is a better method as compared to that. So if I talk about the food industry itself, we have seen the traditional fermentation era, and then came the plant-based protein production era, wherein plant-based sources like pea powder and soya bean gained a lot of popularity. And you also mentioned about the Good Food Institute website, and I have also gone through the website, and they have been publishing a lot of articles about plant-based proteins as well. So, how do you see the precision fermentation technology comparing to the plant-based protein production technology?
It's a good question. I do feel like it's certainly plant-based is more well developed.
Mm-hmm.
People have been eating soy products obviously for years, even sort of analogs to meat products. It's much more well developed in the plant-based world so far. But I think what has people excited about precision fermentation is that in theory, or not in theory, but in actuality, we're not dealing with analogs. We're not making analogs anymore. So if you take a company like Perfect Day, for example, which is sort of they're sort of the groundbreaking company in this area. A couple of other ones too. The Every company is doing the same sort of thing with egg proteins. Now there are many companies out there, more every day, that are trying to not just make mimics where we have to convince people that this tastes good enough to call it a hamburger or a piece of fish, convince them that it's pretty close. So try this instead. Instead, what we're doing is we're actually creating the actual protein product in a bioreactor. So I think that's one critical difference that has people very excited, is that convincing people to change over to an animal, protein diet that's less dependent on animals is challenging, because the taste is often not there, or the texture is not the same, and people, like the sort of the traditional foods that they're used to eating. So I think if you can come along and say, actually, this is milk protein. This is the same exact whey protein that you get in milk from a cow. Here it is, and it never saw a cow. So I think that's what has people excited, and that's really the next sort of generation of technology. It's not just trying to mimic what we had before, but rather moving into new areas, and potentially also into being able to do this at massive scale, with a 10% less, 1% of the resource inputs that animal agriculture requires. So I think that the true sort of the gains over plant-based are that we're actually creating the bioidentical protein of interest, rather than trying to mimic it. And I think the other advantage over plant-based is perhaps some you know this is a controversial topic maybe, but plant-based has gotten to some backlash over being overly processed. A lot of the foods have 100 ingredients, and people don't like to see that. And so when you're talking about a precision fermentation molecule, you're talking about just the ingredient itself, and it tends to be B2B. So it's providing a food ingredient that then people, that the actual retailer can say, this is a dairy protein. This is beta lactoglobulin. This is not something that's trying to be similar. It actually is it, but it's still animal free. So I think that's powerful, and that's why that's why there's so much interest in precision.
Right, understood. So, like as we are talking about the dairy-free milk, the animal-free meat that is being produced, and also the meat and so the milk that we are getting in the form of dairy meat from the precision fermentation processes. So, do you think that in the coming, if I talk about the coming 5 years or maybe the coming 10 years, the future of this particular segment of alternate milk from precision fermentation is going to be a bright one, or you think that there may be more developments coming on which might take over this particular technology?
That's a good question. I mean, we see this in sort of every field. You can take any sort of like growth-oriented field, technology. You could say, the first movers in a particular field, people who see make the connection to see, all right, well, if we use this particular technology for this, it could have this impact. So let's try it. And that's really sort of what Perfect Day and a couple of these other first movers did. It's sort of like a first generation of application. I do think that there's a place for precision fermentation dairy proteins. I don't think that it's probably going to be something that we see like a gallon of milk in the grocery store that's made from animal-free protein. It's definitely going to be a food ingredient. There's so much dairy that is included in various foods. It works much better just from a production standpoint to be a food ingredient, because at the end of the fermentation process, what you have is a dry powder similar to like non-fat dry milk powder, and so that is sold as a dry powdered product. And the people who, or the companies that buy that are, I mean, maybe you might have some end users, some retail customers buying dry milk, I guess, but in general, it's other food manufacturers. So yeah, I mean, and some huge percentage, I don't have the percentage off the top of my head, but it's a huge percentage of the dairy protein industry right now, is allocated toward that non-fat dry milk because it's easily transported. It's water's removed, so it's just highly concentrated protein essentially. And and lactose and other salts and everything. But if you talk about transporting dairy protein, you don't want to be shipping liquid milk around. You want to be shipping a dry product, and so it's a sort of a natural fit for that ingredient, that ingredient application. So I definitely see in the future a strong niche for that usage. Whether or not we'll continue to see sort of like end products, finished products being made, with animal-free products being the sort of number one ingredient or the main reason to buy it, I don't know. I think that it's appealing for a certain subset sector of consumers, but I don't know if that's sufficient demand to drive, and I don't know if it's growing fast enough to drive, to drive the economics of scale that you need, or the economies of scale that you need to be able to produce profitably. So I suggest that it's probably going to find its place as a non-fat dry milk type of ingredient. If you're talking about dairy in particular, I think that the economies, from my perspective, the economics only look better as we go forward, and it's not for a good reason. It's for an unfortunate reason, which is water scarcity. In the U.S., California had this epic. California is the number one dairy producer in the U.S. and producing state, and so it had this just extremely wet year. This past winter was just unusually, high amounts of rain and snow. Even with all of that, it's still in a state of drought over the long term. So I do think that water scarcity will eventually be the driving factor for saying, if we want to continue to eat or to consume dairy proteins, these super nutritious, complete proteins, highly versatile, super functional, all the foods that many of the foods that we love have dairy proteins involved, because the mouth feels just impossible to replicate, and all these different types of foods use them. So if we want to continue to use those proteins in our diets, which I think most people would say we will, we need to find it will be necessary to find ways to make them with less water input, and fermentation can do that.
Right. Totally got your point. Like as per my research, the process, the overall definition of what precision fermentation means. I'll let you take over the reins and please correct me if I'm wrong. The precision fermentation method basically involves the technologies like AI and ML for like kind of creating a database of desired inputs, and those inputs are kind of like they are maybe used at the industrial level or at a bigger scale to genetically modify the microorganisms. Is that right, or would you like to add up something or maybe remove something?
I think that's correct, but that's quite a new development. So, people have been doing precision fermentation for decades,
Right.
since the 90s.
Mhm.
Long before we had machine learning and AI tools available to us, and long before we had the kind of database infrastructure that we have now. So these sort of technology tools are just relatively recent, um,
Mhm.
to this game. So people were doing precision fermentation since the 80s, 90s. I mean, depends on how you define it, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's been around for decades. And so before using this sort of data and technology tools, people, molecular biologists were really the ones in charge.
Mhm.
They were sort of manually finding genes, finding ways to get genes of interest into a different organism, like a bacterium or a yeast, and then the fermentation scientists like myself take that organism and
Right.
say, now how do we scale it up to get it to grow in a bioreactor and produce the protein that it's been engineered to produce. But yeah, so that whole workflow was established long before any kind of ML or AI. But now that we have those tools in hand, I mean, it's like I predict an explosion. It's going to be an incredible ramping up of this technology to find, you know, to use these tools to find new gene targets, new
Right.
ways of incorporating the genes. I mean, we're already seeing it. We're seeing new platforms, new companies coming out saying we use AI and machine learning to generate clones, and we can do it in a clone is a microorganism cell that has the gene of interest in it. Um,
Right.
so these companies are coming along saying we can do this, 10 times faster than the molecular biologists used to have to do it, decades ago, or even
Right.
people were doing 10 years ago. And we can use AI and ML to accelerate everything and to get better genes into
Hmm.
more robust organisms faster. And so it's really an optimization tool, but it's nice because the sort of extremely excellent, diligent, very meticulous scientists, the
Right.
molecular biologists and the chemists of decades ago, they sort of established the technology and said this is possible and you can do it. And then, that long lag phase of like people figuring out methods empirically in the lab, and then all of a sudden now we're hitting that sort of exponential phase where it's like we can take what we've learned, we know it works because of all those efforts from the past, and we can
Right.
we
Right.
can we can use these tech tools that we have to really turn it into this incredible platform. So I predict that's where it's going to go. But yeah, the tech applications are relatively new.
Right. So, like as you yourself mentioned, that these technological applications and this AI and ML database creation, all these things are very recent. And specifically talking about these AI and ML technologies, specifically in the food industry, is I think at the growing stage. Not, which is, I mean, it is not very much adopted in the food industry as of now, but it's growing. So earlier, when these technologies were not much used, not very earlier, but I think maybe 5 to 10 years from now, like earlier, do you think that since you are there in the industry, so you might be knowing this, that the creation and the replication of all these traditional tastes and flavors that are there in the maybe the dairy free milk or any other protein source that you are creating with the precision fermentation technology, at the industrial level, wasn't it a hectic process to kind of replicate the traditional taste, flavor, and so the nutrients at a bigger scale?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's a little bit of a question for like a food application scientist. My role in general has been more on the upstream and the manufacturing side of things. But yeah, I think it is very difficult. The formulation question at the end of the day is really the most important thing. And so food application scientists, I'm not familiar with the literature, but I would be very, very surprised if we don't see again this explosion of application of AI and ML to those fields, because what I mean, a human can make the judgment like, yes, I like that taste, or yeah, that tastes a lot like dairy milk. But humans are very different. Some humans think so, some humans don't. And to run clinical studies like this with robust sort of human subjects, flavor testing, many replications of it, with good controls and all that. I mean, it's really expensive, and it takes a long time. And so if you can optimize that with some kind of AI or ML approach where you're saying, okay, well, our AI is taken all of the sort of clinical type, it's not technically clinical, but it's, all the sort of flavor and sensory profile data, and then learns from all of that historical data and says, here's the formulation that's likely to be, or most likely to be able to replicate for the most people, for the most consumers. um, it's going to be able to replicate that experience most closely, or not even that. I mean, I think we're now entering a point where people are saying, we're not necessarily at a point where, if you're just talking about alternative proteins, why do we feel like we have to just replicate what has been, before? Like, a new generation of people is coming into the world with new tastes, new priorities, new values.
Right.
We don't want to just sort of make it good for what parents and grandparents thought was delicious. Like, maybe there's some way we can use these tools to create something totally different that is, meeting the expectations of a new generation of consumers. So AI and ML might take, you know all of the thousands of food ingredients that are and flavors and tastes and everything that are available, and say, what might fit this particular segment of the new consumer population, really well. What do consumers want? What are they looking for? And do it all with animal-free ingredients, or do it all by minimizing the function according to water consumption. So, like, create something that's delicious, that meets expectations and needs, but then minimize that water consumption term in your function. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are just all these opportunities coming online now with AI and ML, but I don't necessarily, in my field, it's maybe not quite. I don't think it's ever going to be able to. I don't think it's ever going to be possible to, like, get rid of the fermentation scientists completely, or the molecular biologists completely. You're always going to need some kind of human element to be able to, especially in the manufacturing piece. We can automate, and we can do sort of remote controlling of plants, and all that. We can get into all the fancy sort of manufacturing tools, but I think ultimately there is always going to be a place for the human fermentation scientist. But more and more, I think that a lot of the upstream, the way upstream and the way downstream work. So I'm thinking, as you mentioned, the database creation and the target molecule sort of identification, all that work that used to have to be done by humans
Yeah.
can largely be done by AI and ML, and I think they'll come up with even more interesting targets and more use cases. And then on the extreme downside, as I mentioned, that after you've produced your product, then testing it with actual consumers, maybe you don't need to run as many clinical trials if you run it through a whole bunch of AI and ML workflows first. And the AI and ML says, yes, this particular product is highly likely to screen well with human consumers. Then you,
Right.
instead of having to test, a dozen new molecules, you test two.
Right. So, like you yourself mentioned the point of the consumers and how the market or the consumers are going to accept the products produced through this particular technology. I have came across certain examples wherein companies are manufacturing, maybe at the pilot stage itself, they are manufacturing natural sweeteners and egg whites also from the precision fermentation technology. So, do you think that actually in the coming years or maybe over the period of time, the consumers in the different regions of the globe, in almost all the countries, are going to actually accept these genetically modified products that will be available?
That's a great question, and you've definitely put your finger right on sort of a very sensitive and controversial area.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, I would reframe a little bit, and I want to point out that first of all, um, the term GMO is a little complicated, and I think most people, most of the sort of resistance to GMOs is around consuming GMO plants,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, like American huge, agri-tech companies, figured out how to modify, corn. You have thousands of different sort of strains that we've come up with for various reasons. They we feed them to animals. A lot of the crops that we grow have some sort of modification to them. This is the sort of 1990s debate on, do we want to eat tomatoes that have a firefly gene in them, or whatever
Yeah.
the debate was. And I think largely for the populace at large, at least in the U.S., the sort of GMO, the pro GMO folks won, um,
Hmm.
because there's no longer the resistance to eating a crop that has been genetically modified. But I feel like that's a different debate. And I personally, prefer to eat organic. Um, but do I have a problem with eating genetically modified plants? I think that's an open question. It's a difficult question. Um,
Yeah.
but it's a different question than what we're talking about with precision fermentation, because the only thing that's been modified in precision fermentation is, it's sort of like the carrier of the gene. It's the microbial cell, so it's the yeast cell that is then producing your protein. And the protein itself is not a genetically modified anything. It's, in fact, if you look at it on a molecular basis, amino acid to amino acid, that protein is identical to the protein that you would get out of a cow that's only been fed organic grass its whole life, in a pasture with, all the best conditions. So there's no difference between the actual thing that you're eating, the final protein, um, between what you get out of a fermenter made by a GMO yeast versus what you get out of a cow. It's a really different question, I think. Um,
Right.
it comes down to how you feel about modifying any organism genetically, because in a precision fermentation workflow, you modify the strain, you grow up the strain, and then you put it in a big fermenter. It produces that molecule. You then get rid of the organism. You centrifuge it out, or by some method, a filter press or some other kind of method, you separate out that GMO organism, and then by law, you are required to dispose of it in some way. Usually, it's often by, you dry it out, you can landfill it, you can turn it into biogas. You can, in the
Yeah.
U.S., you can incorporate it into animal feed. So it does come back into the food chain in some sense sometimes. But that's very, that takes that has a lot of regulatory oversight for that process. But again, the product at the end of the day, you are not consuming any genetically modified molecule through precision fermentation. So I think it's a different debate. I think that if people understand exactly what they are eating, maybe there would be less concern about it. I know that there's a lot of concern about using GMOs. Europe, I mean, it's just basically a non-starter. Like, no, it's not for human consumption. So I think there's a large debate to be had, but I do think that in some sense it's a debate that is coming out of a sense of, well, I don't know. This is a large question. It's kind of beyond my level of expertise.
Yeah,
With, if talking about like resource constraints, I feel like in some sense we may not have a choice, eventually about whether, due to food, demand for food and shortage of resources, I think there may not be a choice. But anyway, that's beyond my area of
yeah,
expertise.
yeah.
But I do feel like it's important to make that distinction and say you are, when you eat something from a protein from a precision fermentation process, you, the end consumer, are not consuming anything that's been genetically modified. All GMOs have been collected beforehand and disposed of in a very highly regulated way. In fact, it has to be that way by law. And if any, and it has the final product going out the door, the protein, they say it's a protein that's going out the door of the manufacturing facility, it has to be tested. And if there's any DNA that's from a genetically modified organism, if there's any DNA that's detected in that final product, it's not allowed to be released. So so I think it's important to always keep that distinction in mind.
Right. I totally agree with you on this. Another thing which just while you were talking just struck my mind as you said that by law there are some parameters that are required by law and you have to kind of disclose that when the product is out in the market. So do you think that there when we talk specifically about precision fermentation and also maybe alternate proteins in this particular discussion, do you think that maybe somewhere or the other the governments are still lagging in putting forward some regulatory standards or maybe any government initiative in this particular segment, I mean for this particular technology in the food industry? Do you feel that?
I do. I do feel like there's quite a lot of work to be done, and organizations again like GFI have really led the charge in this in many ways, um, because they do have a whole set of, of, of folks who are responsible for looking at the regulatory requirements in different countries and direct contact with government entities, to try to get these questions on the table. But yeah, I do feel like there's a lot of work to be done, and I this is I like to point to this particular example because it's something that I find actually quite interesting, and it's sort of, I don't know, it to me it really sort of makes me think. But I think part of the reason why there has been some maybe lack of real progress on the regulatory side. I think for one thing, probably everybody's sort of looking at the lay of the land to see what lawsuits are going to be levied or
Right.
sort of generated, because we saw after the first wave of plant-based products, we saw you know immediately we saw these sort of lawsuits being over what is milk, the word milk, what products can have the word milk on it, or what is meat, what counts as something that can have this word on it. So I think in some sense there's a little bit of uncertainty around how those particular fights are going to be resolved. Sometimes it's gone in the direction of one set of stakeholders, sometimes it's gone in the direction of the other. So I think there's some uncertainty there. so I think there's that. There's the uncertainty from the first wave of plant-based products about how things can be labeled, which so I think that's one factor. The second factor that I would propose, and this is particular to precision fermentation, is that it's more than just a question of the law or of sort of a business or a legal question. I think it's a fundamentally deep question about sort of the nature of biology. I mean, if you talk about a molecule that is identical, from an amino acid sequence perspective, identical to an animal protein, a protein a whey protein that comes out the door of a perfect day facility. If you take that and you look at it under if you do analysis by mass spec or whatever, and you do your, so you look at the sequence of amino acids, and you do the same thing for a whey protein coming out of a cow, you will see no difference, no detectable difference. And so the question is that protein that came out of a perfect day facility, what kind of a protein is it? Is it a bovine protein?
Yeah.
Is it a yeast protein because a yeast was the actual thing that made it, or is it both, or is it neither? And so I don't think that governments really know. I don't think anybody knows how to classify it. I think maybe we need to get some philosophers involved or something. I don't know, because I did, it's hard to say what this thing is. We're dealing with a question of what is this thing? Is it we know it's a protein because it's a sequence of amino acids, but I think we're dealing, we need to answer questions about classification on a deeper level before we can ask the government to start setting regulations about it.
Right. Yeah, as you were mentioning about this thing that the classification is required and people, that's a very genuine question. Which actually protein are you talking about? So with this, I just remembered that I was going through an article before this podcast. This was about precision fermentation itself. And in that, they mentioned about some companies and also some startups in the precision fermentation and specifically uh, protein and alternate milk segment that are there in India and also in countries like Australia and California, as you said. So someone commented on that particular blog that we already have many cows in our country. You don't need to put in technology there. So when I read it, I kind of laughed because I thought that that person's perspective was genuine. That okay, we have a lot of cows. You don't need to put in technology. But what is your say on that? Because actually, I think that the countries where there are a lot of cows, and if I talk about India, here the cows are tagged, and like there are a lot of cows, and a lot of people are getting employment through dairy cultivation and through kind of the milk that they sell from their own cattle. So do you think that this particular technology is also this has a kind of a negative side that it is also taking away employment of a lot of people, maybe in the rural areas?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's very difficult. It's a very difficult point. I recently, back in January, I gave a talk at a Cargill meeting. Well, it was held at a Cargill facility, but it was a sort of a collection of dairy company representatives, people interested in working in the dairy industry, and scientists in the dairy industry. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to say, okay, here's this new technology that's gonna replace all cow. I mean, I don't think it's not accurate to say that. I don't think, I mean, to replace all of the milk production you'd need something like, I think I calculated this out quite a while ago, but you need something like 3 orders of magnitude more precision fermentation capacity than currently exists in the world. I mean, it's just not possible, probably ever. I mean, that's some people probably wouldn't want to hear that, but it's not feasible in the near term anyway. I'll say that much. But on the other hand, so I live in Minnesota in the U.S., which is central Midwest area. Minnesota's like top 5 dairy producing states in the country. Wisconsin is number 2 right next door. And it's a highly sensitive topic. Like nobody wants this traditional industry, especially in the rural parts of the Midwest. They're already struggling to survive. Their farms are being foreclosed. The price of milk fluctuates, and everything people start losing their farms. It's very sad. And so to have a new technology coming along to add pressure to that it's not great. I mean, it's not helping the people who are working in work, who want to work with the land and work with food and fiber. These are the people that we want to be empowering, not trying to undercut. On the other hand, there's also, and sorry to just use examples from the U.S., but this is what I'm most familiar with. But I do think there's probably analogies worldwide. In the U.S. we have what's called the Rust Belt, and that is sort of like the old manufacturing base also in the Midwest, but slightly east, where we had all the steel mills that back in the in the early 20th century were sort of producing steel at the highest rates in the world, and then all the manufacturing centers from the mid part of the 20th century, the automotive manufacturing, all that kind of infrastructure that was then sort of it's been hollowed out over the past 50 years. And so a lot of those folks who are used to manufacturing jobs, those jobs don't exist anymore, and now they've had to find other things. So while something like precision fermentation, yes, it might be taking away some market share from traditional dairy. On the other hand, it opens up all kinds of new job opportunities for other rural people
Skilled labor,
skilled workforce, people who want to work in manufacturing. I mean, it's a different sector of people, and dairy farmers, don't necessarily want to be retrained as precision fermentation operators, but when you look at it as a whole, and again, we're not talking about individuals, because on an individual level, individual farmers, the stories are heartbreaking, and awful. And it's a way of life that is kind of passing. And I would argue it's going to pass whether or not precision fermentation, is involved. I mean, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, we see family farms disappearing because large agribusinesses are, dominating and buying up the cows and the land. And as milk consumption in the U.S. declines, the demand is decreasing. But very complicated, sort of global economics. For now, the precision fermentation industry is a fraction, small fraction, like I don't know, 1/10% of what the total dairy industry. So there's no threat in the near term, and in order to be a threat, a lot of precision fermentation factories will have to be built. But I would argue that any sort of so like any industry that's threatened, there's probably opportunities for new industries to come in, including those in rural areas and in what we call the Rust Belt in the U.S. People who are depressed areas of rural U.S. Former manufacturing bases that can be revitalized by something like precision fermentation. Come in, retrain, offer skilled labor. This is, it can be a new industry.
Right. One thing that, as you said, like I am framing up questions from what you are saying. As you said that if one industry like maybe sees a downside, then that's kind of a positive or maybe a growth factor for some other industry, and that is for all the areas, urban, rural, or like it's a general factor. So, in that sense, if I talk about this alternate proteins, or maybe let's take the precision fermentation space itself, uh, would you like to highlight a few of the maybe the key trends that you see emerging in this particular through this particular technology or in this particular space in the coming years?
Sure. Yeah. If we're talking, are you thinking just focused on alternative proteins?
Yeah.
Sure. So, we talked a little bit about the AI and ML applications, and I do see those as really blossoming,
Right.
and becoming very, very important. And in a way, there are several opportunities for it to address sort of consumer demand and also sort of improve productivity. I think that this is sort of a little bit of a speculative thing, but I imagine, as I said, maybe there are ways to develop new products for new tastes, a new generation with new values. I mean, it's sort of a silly example here, but if you order a pizza these days, you go onto the website and you order and you choose what you want for it. And sorry, this is a very sort of like, I don't know, U.S. bias example, but so you go and you order what you want, what you put on your pizza, and I love the idea of like, okay, so you get to your cheese option, right? And do you want no cheese? Okay. Do you want, regular cheese? Do you want, extra cheese of the regular cheese? Or do you want company
Yeah.
X's super cheese, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like super stretchy, super delicious. It's super nutritious. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, for a price premium, a lot of people are going to choose super cheese if it really, if it really has all these additional benefits. And so I think that's, at least in the near term, since precision fermentation is probably not going to be able to displace all of dairy production in the near term, as we
Yeah.
just discussed, I do think that there is an opportunity for alternative proteins to come up with these, like, even better versions of what we're used to. You mentioned alternative sweeteners. I think that's another space that is ready to really launch sweet proteins. This has been a technology that's been around for a long time. Manila and Brazilian, these proteins that are, have they're thousands of times more sweet than sucrose.
Right.
They don't have the same mouthfeel all the time, and oftentimes they have like an aftertaste. But I think that's an area that's ripe for application. Sort of like super functional ingredients that don't rely on economies of scale in the same
Right.
way that something like a whey protein does. I mean, the way that, or the best approach for a company that's making that kind of bulk protein ingredient to become profitable is just to reduce costs and then hope that the price stays high in the market, because and then produce at as high a scale as you possibly can so that you get all of the economies of scale, and even then you're just barely making it profitable. But with
Right.
something, I feel like so that's for like a bulk protein for just raw human consumption. I feel like with these high functionality proteins, like sweet proteins for food, or for like a super cheese kind of a
Right.
concept.
Right.
um, I do feel like that could be a way for companies to be profitable, without having to rely on massive economies of scale.
Hmm.
So that's one trend, I think, and
Yeah.
that's directly amenable to AI and ML. I mean, it's like, how are you going to develop a protein with unusual or extremely excellent functionality? Well, you can do it manually with a really great team of scientists, but certainly if you have an AI or ML approach, you have an advantage to do that. Another trend I would say I see in alternative proteins is, well, if you're talking about strictly in terms of alternative food proteins, is really, you know, a lot of the constraints that we see right now are just in terms of strain capacity to produce at the sort of performance levels that they need to be. I mean, precision fermentation in some sense is sort of I think of it as like using a scalpel as a machete. You know, the technology was invented in order to make very, very, as the name implies, very precise changes in a protein, like make an insulin product that is, well, that's a hormone, but make an enzyme that has a very particular functionality, or make a pharmaceutical. It really all comes back to pharmaceuticals. For the biopharma industry is really the place where this technology sort of got off the ground. And I mean, what does pharma do? They're interested in like an extremely precise functionality, and so they manipulate the protein. They change whatever they need to change in the DNA sequence or in the post-translational modifications in order to make it have this functionality of interest that is a therapeutic. And so we're taking that sort of tool and we're using it to make food, which is a little bit, it's a little bit of a misappropriation in some sense, but it works. But I think there's a lot of work to do to make sure that we can get to that economical production level. A lot of the strains that we see, the sort of volumetric productivities maybe aren't quite there. The yields are still low. Not low, but just like not they need to be higher. So improving the productivity, including really it boils, if you're talking about a fed batch system, it comes down to sort of the titer that you can achieve in a certain amount of time, which is really, I mean, that's just productivity. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to do on strain development, and that work is being done and will continue to be done in academia and in industry. But I think to really to capitalize on the momentum, it really needs, there needs to be some breakthroughs in strain development, I think. Whether that means finding new strains. I mean, so far the industry has relied on a certain handful of strains like E. coli and Pichia pastoris, a few other sort of high-profile strains that we know how to manipulate and we have a lot of data for over the past few decades. But maybe it's time to introduce new strains, which is hard. It's very difficult work to come up with a new platform, but it might. I'm seeing that maybe as a need. And the third thing that I think, and sorry if this is being long-winded here, but the third thing that I would really like to push this, because I see it as more and more of a need. I was on a panel when I was at GFI with some folks who were proposing that part of the problem with precision fermentation for this kind of application is that really when you're generating a product this way, I mean, yes, you end up with a protein product at the end of the day, but if you look at your yields, you're like 10%, something like that. So for every glucose molecule that you put in, or every kilo of glucose that you used in your fermentation, you get, if you're doing well, your yields are something like 0.1 kilo of protein, right? So where does the rest of that go? What happens to the rest of that carbon? And the answer is it goes to either it gets burned off as CO2, so the organism just in its metabolism, it releases it as CO2, or else it makes it makes biomass. And really it's the biomass, the organism's biomass that is the sort of, in my opinion, it's sort of an elephant in the room, because what do we do with all of that waste yeast? Say you're using a Pichia pastoris, you get your product at the end of the day, it's 10% of the glucose that you put in. The rest of the carbon is going to yeast biomass. And what do you do? We discussed this with the GMO concept. What do you do with all that yeast biomass that you just made, and you've spent all this electricity and natural gas and energy and time to make? You dry it down and you landfill it, or you turn it into
Yeah.
something like biogas. So in a way, I feel like that's a huge challenge for precision fermentation, because it's most of what you're producing is organism biomass, GMO biomass, that then you have to treat as a waste stream. So other ways of valorizing that particular waste stream, I think, will really help the economics of precision fermentation in general, and especially from an alternative protein perspective, where you're making alternative proteins for food. The economies of scale have to be there in order for that to be economical. And so if you're just wasting a lot of your carbon in the form of waste biomass, it's going to make it more and more difficult to get that economy of scale. So I think that waste stream handling, whether it's valorized or you find some other application for it, or you recover it and use it as an input, sort of a circular model. I think that there's a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, and we are running short of time, but I have this question. I'll finish it very quickly. That, as you mentioned about this thing, that the very genuine question, that there is a lot of biomass that is being created, and apart from that, the rest of the carbon is being emitted as carbon dioxide. So, don't you think that this particular like that is a part of the process, but this particular thing, that the rest of the carbon is getting emitted as carbon dioxide, is kind of contradictory to the sustainable tag given to the precision fermentation technology? Like, this is a very big challenge.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there is something to that. Yeah, I mean, even if you think about like making beer, I mean, when you make beer, you're all of those bubbles that are being made in your fermentation vat, that's all CO2. And
Yeah.
it's just a fact of aerobic, and anaerobic metabolism. So,
Yeah.
so yes, you're right on the one hand, that yes, there is CO2 being generated. On the other hand, it's a point source, right? So
Yeah.
every fermentation plant has an exhaust pipe coming out the top. And so there are lots of technologies out there where you can capture the CO2 coming out of the exhaust pipe. And compare that with thousands of cows, you know,
Hmm.
that where there's no point source. You can't collect all of
Right.
that CO2 or methane and capture it, whatever. So I think that's the advantage that precision fermentation has, just by its nature as an industrial sort of a setup. You can put a scrubber on top of that exhaust pipe and capture most of the CO2. It's not cheap to do that, but it
Right.
is, the technology currently exists. You can buy CO2 scrubbers. They're currently available commercially. So it's possible to address, even if it's not currently cheap.
Right. I am so overwhelmed by your knowledge. I have so many questions, but we don't have time. So, thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing your invaluable insights on today's topic. I am sure that this would give a lot clearer understanding to interested listeners on the prospect of the precision fermentation and alternate proteins market.
Thank
So,
you very
on
much.
an
It's my
yeah,
my pleasure and my honor and privilege to be with you today. Thanks very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for tuning in and listening to Deep Tech Talk, a tech podcast by BIS Research. In case you wish to know more about different industries, do visit our website at bisresearch.com and read through different market intelligence studies that have been published by us across industries. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us on Spotify and Amazon Music.